Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast. We are still in lockdown, still without football, but we are still there for you. I'm Dave Freezer. We're also coming to you on Future Radio 107.8 FM and joined this week by Paddy Davitt, Connor Southwell, and we called the boss in, Head of Sport, Chris Lakey, making a cameo appearance on the PinkUn podcast. Chris, how's life in North Norfolk?
Well, I'm sitting next to my window. I can see, I've never seen so many people running. I don't think the Olympics would have had this many people. And I can tell you that my home in Norfolk is a small town with the fittest dogs in the whole of Norfolk. There has been so many dogs. I actually know the dogs by name now. It's ridiculous. But life's grand. The sun shines. It's smashing in context.
Have you been tempted to walk the cats just to join in?
No. I've been chasing them at night time sometime, but herding cats is an easy thing to do. I haven't been out much, to be honest with you. It's been quite busy. I think people will probably appreciate that while there is no sport, we've been providing sport. So, it has been hard work. But, it's different.
Yeah, in the context of all the very serious stuff that is, of course, going on around the country, but that's not what we're here to talk about. I'm sure you're all getting your daily fix of that from the news headlines. I have to say, I think it is important to limit how much of the sort of negative news you take in at the moment, because I think it can get to you a little bit when we're all having to spend so much time at home. Connor, how are you? I mean, you've got cats as well. I mean, when I said walking cats, I definitely had Tiger King in my head, because I've been eagerly consuming that from Netflix, which is just the most bonkers program that I've ever seen. And they literally walking tigers and lions around the park. So yeah, I've been tempted.
Not quite yet. No, not quite yet. There may come a point. As I get up every morning, and everyone in my house is sort of furloughed or student or school or whatever. So I'm the only one working at the moment. So as I open the door to my bedroom, usually both my cats appear, and you let them out every day, and you think, gosh, you have more freedom than I do at the moment. But there you go. They enjoy it. There's a really loud bird outside my window at the moment, which I'm slightly concerned for, to be honest, because my cats have been known to return them not alive to the back door. That we've had one incident a couple of years ago where we opened the back door and there was just a pair of birds' feet. There was nothing else. It was just a pair of birds' feet. I could tell you several tales of.
You're right, as long as it's not an ostrich.
It wasn't an ostrich, no. Although we have had a bird's egg before as well, so you do get some weird and wonderful things being a cat.
We had a newt the other day.
But not tempted to walk them quite yet.
A newt?
Yep, a newt.
Lovely.
And funnily enough, I know where it came from. And the neighbour who has the pond told me the other day, he looked forlornly at me. He said, "We've got nothing left in our pond now." So I had to look all innocent because I know where it's gone.
Well, I've never had a dog, but from being out on our government-approved daily exercise, it's sort of the first time in my life that I thought I could get on board with having a dog. Pad, how are the keepy uppies coming? He's still over 100?
114 now, Dave.
114? Wow. I need to get a football.
Yeah.
114?
114, yeah.
Wow.
Good Friday. I haven't been out since, to be fair.
Farker's having him join the squad after the lockdown.
No. My mate Rich, who listens to this, big fan of the show, what we do, lives up in York. Because obviously I threw that in, didn't I, 2 or 3 episodes ago. He said nonchalantly he went out in his garden, he did 100 straight off the spin. So that's quite annoying, really, Rich.
We're going to need video evidence saying I think of this. 100.
No, it's not my style, Connor. It's not my style, but I'm not a man that can lie about these things. So let me tell you, I've only done it once, 114. There's a lot of 20s and 30s and 40s in there as well. It's a bit of a painful process. But
not bad.
Yeah.
Try a tennis ball.
So I highly recommend it. In fact, now I'm talking about it, I'm getting the urge. I'm looking through my window. The sun's out. Might have to be lunchtime activity.
Nice.
Wait.
Just don't do.
That mainly, Dave. Yeah, I did want to throw in because we've talked about TV or poor TV that we sort of end up watching. Now, Good Friday, there was Indiana Jones was on one of those films on BBC One. The one
Oh
with the
yeah,
skull.
yeah. Which one? Temple of Doom?
Is that the one with the skull where they got the skull and they have to carry it back? It's got John Hurt in, and he's like the mad kind of.
They've all got a skull, Paddy.
Have they?
Every single bloody Indiana Jones one's got a skull.
Okay, fair enough. It's the one with the Germans, but that probably doesn't narrow it down either.
Oh yeah, that's not Temple of Doom, is it?
And it went the one where he discovers he's got a lad and he's basically the spit of him, but he's a bit of an adventurer. And
is that the one where the motorcycle goes through the university being chased? Slides under the desk.
Yeah, that might be the one actually.
Yeah, that was rubbish.
No, it was good. So yeah, I mean, I just stumbled on that right 5 minutes into it and found myself watching it for 2 hours. So simple pleasures.
I think that's Raiders of the Lost Ark, isn't it? I think.
Is it? Okay, fair enough.
Anyway,
yeah. So that was my TV highlight of the week, boys. So
well, just be careful with your keepy uppies. Don't do what that Villa striker did and knock his window through.
Oh,
I did see that. Yeah, I did see that.
Who was that?
I can't remember which player it was, but I bet his other half was not impressed. Me and my dad once did that when I was a kid.
His manager was
with a cricket ball, and the garage window stayed broken for quite a while, and stepmum was not impressed. Anyway, where are we at, Pad? With lockdown, with I think it's just more opinions every week, isn't it? Really, I mean, I've seen that we've had the Brighton chief executive, the Palace manager Roy Hodgson, and everybody's just sort of speculating. But I thought the line from the Brighton chief exec was quite interesting in terms of the lawyers are going to be busy, because there's no way you're going to keep all the clubs, all the officials happy, are you?
No, absolutely not. And also, that's Paul Barber is the gentleman you mentioned there, Dave. He did also mention in that interview, which I think went out over Easter on Brighton's channels, that aspect, but the actual aspect of when they get back, he said, look, when the death rate, sadly, in this country is up around, as it was there in the 900s, we're at 700s, but there's a lot of talk. Obviously, we don't need to get into the accuracy of the numbers and the inclusion of the care home numbers, sadly. But when you're at those levels on a daily basis, it's not even something you can discuss when football comes back, because it's totally inappropriate. It's inconsequential in the bigger scheme of what we're all going through, living through day after day. But hypothetically, if football does come back, then when it comes back, will impact hugely on the contractual side. I mean, FIFA have talked about they will put procedures in place to allow player contracts and the transfer window to wrap around any proposed, resumption of the current season. But we're all in hypothetical territory, so. Lawyers may well be getting busy if it comes to light that a resumed season goes beyond June the 30th, which is the usual date for player contracts, certainly. And Norwich, not so much. I think that would impact on them. We've talked about this before. I don't think there's any what you would call frontline options who are going to be out of contract. Alex Tete was the one who they got sorted. But there will be other clubs who clearly will be concerned at what that means in terms of moving forward. But, everything we talk about in this context, we have to caveat with there's far more important things to worry about. And in that context, we're no nearer knowing when football will resume. There is another Premier League shareholders meeting scheduled for this coming Friday, I believe. Whether that provides clarity, hard to see, because we're still being told we're not at the peak in terms of the health curve. And until we are, then I don't think anything definitive is going to be decided. I've seen in the last 24, 48 hours about League 1 and 2 clubs now starting to sit down and talk collectively about player wage deferrals. And did Rick Parry, I think is EFL's chief exec or something in the EFL, had written to clubs to say they could complete the season in 56 days. And, there's been a bit of pushback on that. But ultimately, football wouldn't be doing their job, I suppose, if they wasn't making plans. But when those plans actually become actual reality, I think, is completely dependent on the health situation. And at the moment, we're the wrong side of the curve, so it's all hypothetical, isn't it?
Yeah, and those hypotheticals have got to be in place for when the button can be pressed, really. And I guess it's still most likely that we're going to see games in some form behind closed doors. But Connor, we did talk about Belgium, didn't we? And Rocky Bashiri being out on loan there at St Truidense, and that their season has been cancelled. But I think UEFA have actually pushed back on it, haven't they, and said that they're not that pleased with it being ended.
No, they're not, and I think that was the reaction at the time. It was kind of that they'd got a body away from the league to sort of decide how best to do it, and that was the solution they came up with. And you have to say, given the situation is that they had one game left and pretty much everything, I think, bar the relegation playoffs had been decided, then it's fairly logical, providing you can come up with a solution to those playoffs. But then there's an argument to say, well, okay, you could have them as a little pre-season tournament, and you could have them whenever the football gets underway and when it's safe to do so. But yeah, there has been pushback on that, which I think is probably surprised a few others in football, and perhaps shows that this desire not to void the season is perhaps coming from even above the Premier League and even coming from above those governing bodies. So it's a really difficult situation, I think, for everyone, because not one solution that I've heard proposed at this moment in time is completely just, and it is completely 100% without fault. And for every situation, you've got a number of pros and cons. And do you void the season? Well, okay, then you're almost allowing those who have struggled this year, Norwich as a prime example, another opportunity with perhaps £100 million that they wouldn't have got otherwise to say have another go, whilst of course Liverpool not winning the title, and we can get into stuff like that, and that's just England. And when you're talking about over the continent doing that with the French league, La Liga, which isn't decided title-wise, Bundesliga, which isn't decided title-wise, then I think it becomes very difficult. So for me, the solution has to be they have to find a way to end it. It's just a case of how they do it and when it's safe to do so. And I've always sort of said that it would be a shame if it ends up behind closed doors, but I think for most of Europe now, that's the reality that they're facing. That is going to have to be behind closed doors football, and unfortunately, they're going to have to be games without supporters, which is going to be very, very tough for everyone. And I think for some supporters, there is anger about the way that football has handled this crisis. I think from all levels, it does feel a bit leaderless, I suppose. They haven't really taken ownership of it. And again, it's difficult because it's unprecedented and no one sort of has been in this before. But it has felt quite responsive. And Paddy said about the Premier League meetings, but equally, every week it seems to be them just pushing things back a little bit and buying themselves a bit more time. You can only do that for a certain amount of time before people get frustrated. And obviously with more pressing matters, I think football has rightly taken a backseat. And for me, the discussion around when it continues feels a little bit, I don't know, it feels a little bit uncomfortable, I guess, at the moment when you've seen all those death statistics. And I think for most people it does as well. And I think football has to make sure that it's not seen to be a little bit untasteful, I suppose, in the way it's operating, and maybe that's behind the Premier League's thought process. But it's very difficult to see how this resumes and how they can solve this issue, because there's no solution that I've heard has been really 100% viable at this moment in time.
No, I think you have to give a little bit of leeway to everyone. You know, for instance, if you take this to the top of this situation, there is a little bit of anxiety around the government not putting out further details about how we're going to move out of lockdown, aren't we? And Labour sort of putting the pressure on now, saying, you know, give us an idea of what's going to come. So, you know, football is sort of a similar situation in a less important scenario. So, the whole situation, I do think we need a little bit of feedback. Chris, obviously you've been involved with football for a long time. Clearly never been involved in anything to this extent. But what do you make of it all? I heard our friend, colleague Chris Gorham, Radio Norfolk's commentator, of course, he floated quite an interesting idea on the scrimmage last week, which was to basically cancel the season and then pick it up again in a year's time. So go back in March 2021, you pick up the season where it was. And then once we're allowed to play football again, say that's in November, December, January, whatever that is, to have like a big tournament, I guess like the League Cup or something like that, where a lot of the funds raised go towards the NHS. That's effectively like a big pre-season. So that's just sort of another interesting one. I think the issue with that would probably be transfers. You know, our club's going to have the same squads if you come back in a year's time. It's so complex. But what do you sort of see as the most likely outcome as we sort of stand today?
Cool, cheers for that.
Hospital pass.
There are millions of different issues arising, not least the finances, not least I mean, I personally think next season's knockout competitions should be put on hold to accommodate league games from this season and a new season. I think any winter breaks go by the board as well. We may have to extend next season a little bit more, but then you have the Euros coming up, which you wouldn't have had. Then you've got sponsorship deals that are already in place that are problematic. And you also mustn't forget that it's behind closed doors football is okay just to get results out of the way, but it's not okay for a football club that has half a dozen matches to organise and play behind closed doors without any income from supporters. The lower you go down to the leagues, and don't forget as well, if you're a middle table, if you're bang slap in the middle of a league and you're told, look, you're going to play behind closed doors, you'll say, why? It's nothing to do with us.
Yeah.
You know, there are teams who have got the whatever happens, their position won't change. You know, they can't be relegated, can't be promoted or anything. So, you know, there are so many different issues. I quite like the idea of doing something proper with a competition for the NHS.
Yeah.
But a part of me says a Tory government should be doing that. A Tory government should be looking after the NHS. So I'm afraid that whilst I think it's a good thing for football to do, we shouldn't be in a position where it has to do it. I can't even begin. The one thing we haven't got is a date, because a lot of it revolves around the date when things become normal enough for us to have some semblance of normal life. Nobody knows when that is.
No.
You know, we can't tell. Once you've got a date, then you can start organising and working things out. Without that, don't know. Don't forget as well that this goes down to a certain level. Steps 3 to 7 have already cancelled their seasons, expunged all results, and that has not gone down well.
3 to 7 of non-league, that is.
Yeah, of non-league, yeah.
And
the league that Kings Lynn are in, they're currently waiting.
Yeah.
They don't know, and they might not know until next week. They're being told to vote alongside what the league board says, which is, let's scrap the season. The next vote is, then do we decide we're going to have promotion or relegation or not? A little bit democracy would help. I don't think all clubs. I had a man who was involved in a Norfolk Youth Combination League team email me back and forth last night about his team that he has an interest in. Why have we been told our results count for nothing? The last season, if we want to call it the current season, must have some relevance. It must have some relevance. It cannot just be expunged.
I think,
and I tell you what, if it is, pay back all the money that footballers paid in fines. Won't do that, will they?
There's got to be a bit of common sense to it, though, in terms of that's such a low level, isn't it? That it doesn't mean
Probably
anything
not, but for the
in the
people
big
who
scheme
take
of
part
things.
in it, the results do. Not the finances, but the results do. And all the way from top to bottom, what you've just done the week before, you know, the last week you were playing, it should mean something.
Yeah, well, no one can take away the reality of it, can they? They might be officially expunged from records, but
if you're
it
Kings Lynn Town, you're second in the table, done absolute cartwheels to get there, and suddenly somebody says, "No, that's shocking. Can't do that. Can't do it in my view."
I'm sure Norwich City will be desperate to hang on to some of their results from earlier this season. The 5-1 at home to Villa and 2-0 at home to Watford. They don't want them being expunged.
Well, I'm afraid, you know, if it's points per game, Norwich get relegated.
Yeah.
And deservedly so. You know, I'm sorry, but, you know, it is deservedly so. But anyway.
And that moves things on nicely.
Thanks for that question. I don't have the magic wand.
Don't worry, I've got a hospital pass coming for Paddy as well. Because we're going to move on to furloughing.
He'll juggle it for 140 times or 140.
You just took my line now. I think I've got to go and do me keepy uppies now, Dave.
I'm just getting an important call. It's Stuart Webber. Sorry. Yes, furloughing. Let's go there. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of rubbish spouted, I would have said as well, about it. And essentially, the Norwich City situation, it shouldn't be judged in the same way that the national headlines are talking about Tottenham, Liverpool, and even Bournemouth. You know, Bournemouth have got a billionaire owner. We all know the reality at Norwich City is they are a self-funding club. So them furloughing their off-field staff is a very different deal, isn't it, Pad? And you were doing a bit of digging on sort of the loss they're expecting to make, weren't you, in a piece you did at the end of last week?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, two things before we get into it. I mean, you talk about the ownership, and there is a huge disparity between wealth in terms of Premier League owners between Norwich and the rest. That's indisputable, I think. But also, what is the difference between those clubs you quoted? It's essentially that they've had multiple years of Premier League income. You know, Norwich only came up last season and came up with, by their last set of recorded accounts, a big deficit before they even got started, before they received any money. They came up with a deficit, hence why they had to sell the players they had to sell in previous summers under Webber and Farker. So that's the background to why Norwich have done that decision. And any parallels you draw with them and any Premier League club is wrong, in my opinion. Now, the issue is, for those who still don't agree with it, that they look at it as a Premier League club, access to Premier League revenue. They shouldn't be using a government subsidy to use that phrase. And morally, it's wrong. So people are entitled to have that view. But as I say, if you accept the premise that Norwich don't have the financial backdrop to any other Premier League club, and as they made it clear when they confirmed they were furloughing some non-members and playing staff, that was to safeguard the future of the club. That's the top and bottom of it. So, you know, I would tend to be willing to sort of side with how Norwich as a club have approached this, rather than those, quite rightly, you feel, you know, morally it is wrong that a Premier League football club needs access to government funds. And then to pick up the point you mentioned there, that is, by all accounts, what they're looking at. If football didn't resume this season, separating the broadcast revenue, which they would obviously not get the full amount that they're due, and there's talks of rebates and so on and so forth. But what is indisputable is that they've estimated, or they're working or modelling to a potentially 15 million loss in match day income, season ticket refunds, casual ticket refunds, the commercial elements, you know, their main sponsors, Dafabet. I think there's talk that if, again, the season didn't restart, then there would be monies that maybe they've been paid that would have to go back. So all of these strands, you pull them together, and inside the club, they are having to really seriously think how they plug a 15 million hole, because that was money that they would have budgeted to be receiving. Nobody could really have foreseen we'd be in this situation. And that's then before you even get into the loss of broadcast monies. Burnley were quite clear a couple of Saturdays ago. Official statement went out. If the season doesn't resume, they're in for a 50 million deficit, 5-0. The bulk of that is the broadcast revenue. Norwich's figures mightn't be quite as graphic as that, but they're certainly going to be upwards of 30-40 million deficit that was budgeted for that isn't coming in. So in that context, when you're a self-sustaining, self-financing, self-funding club, if they've taken the option to go down the furlough route to protect jobs and protect their staff, with the caveat, of course, that they've topped up wages, so no member of Norwich's staff has been furloughed and is earning less money than they were before, I personally think they've done what they feel they had to do and they were right to do. And, you know, it's not a good look, agreed. I can see that aspect, particularly now. I think Bournemouth are the latest club, as Tottenham have Liverpool have, who initially suggested they were going to use the furlough scheme and have now rowed back from that, which basically leaves Norwich and Newcastle. And, you know, that's probably not good company to be keeping. But again, it's that, for me, the final point I would make is, if you're comparing Newcastle's wealth with Mike Ashley and, you know, his massive business empire with Norwich City and their owners, then it is chalk and cheese. So, you know, it isn't fair, I don't think, for Norwich to be criticised for using the furloughing scheme. And to be fair, we carried it yesterday. Gary O'Neill, former player, who questioned the timing of the Sinani deal, but didn't question Norwich's right to furlough. He knows that Norwich are a club that don't have the financial wherewithal of these other Premier League rivals, and so if they feel they've had to do that, in Gary O'Neill's words, then he would say that is the right thing to do. So, you know, there probably isn't going to be a right or wrong answer to this. People have taken their view on it, and as I say, there's moral dimensions as well as financial, but I think ultimately you have to trust the people who are the custodians of the football club, and that's not so much the owners, but the executive committee and they, at every stage in the last season or two, have tried to do what's best for the club. And I would look through what's happening with the furloughing scheme through that filter, that they're trying to do the best for the club. End of.
One thing, a couple of things I'd add to that as well, actually. I mean, you mentioned there, of course, it's some off-field staff. It's not all of their off-field staff. And we're not talking players here. I think if you're talking about paying players with furloughed money, I think that's a totally different dimension. Of course, some lower league clubs are having to look at that because their finances compared to Norwich are in far more delicate situation. In a way, Norwich are in a stable position. But just to reflect a little bit, if you remember back on the finances, they had seen a £38 million loss in the last set of accounts. That was due to be probably about a £16 million profit this year they were forecasting. So that is now, that £15 million loss that they're probably going to make means that profit is going to be gone. That is just in basic terms. But also the big thing is they've got relegation hanging over their heads. That is a drastic loss in revenue. I've got some figures here. So their drop in turnover, this is Norwich City's drop, from when they were in the Premier League in 2016, their turnover was 98 million. After relegation, the next year it dropped to 75 million. 2017-18, it dropped to 61 million. And then 2018-19, the season that thankfully they got promoted and got themselves out of a financial hole, their turnover was 33.7 million. So once you're out of the Premier League, we all know that income just goes off a cliff. It's huge. That's why they have to have parachute payments. Norwich have had to budget for being relegated. That's how they set out at the start of the season in terms of finances. And as we stand here today with, 9 games left of the Premier League season? I've forgotten how many games we played now, or was it 8 games left? They are bottom of the league and well on course for relegation. So that, of course, they still have to budget for that huge amount of loss. The one final point I would make is that Norwich City are a considerable taxpayer. So why shouldn't they be able to take money back from the government? The Premier League in 2016-17 was worth £3.3 billion in tax. The Premier League alone, not the whole of English football, but just the Premier League, to the government, to the country. So why should a major taxpayer not be able to turn to that for off-field staff who it is maintaining jobs? We're talking about people in the ticket office who probably earn 18, 20 grand a year. We're not talking about footballers here earning 10 grand a week. It's a very different issue. So I think we've just in that brief discussion, we've shown how complex that is. And you cannot just sum this up in a snarky little tweet saying, oh, Norwich City are a disgrace for doing that. That's what annoys me. And generally the discussion of football on Twitter is so pointless because it's far more complex than 240 characters to discuss something properly. Anyway, so we could go on about this all day. I think that's probably that. So Connor, let's go back to Dan El-Sinani. That was announced on Friday, wasn't it? And Gary O'Neill very sort of unwisely talked about it and has sort of tried to almost sort of shamed Norwich a little bit. And he was quite inaccurate in what he was saying. But Dan El-Sinani is the one big bit of business. He was the sort of Good Friday present for Norwich fans, wasn't he?
Was that for me? Sorry,
for
I missed
you, Connor,
you.
Yeah.
I cut out a minute there.
Oh, sorry, did you not hear that? Dan El-Sinani was confirmed on Friday, wasn't he? So that was sort of a Good Friday Easter present for Norwich fans, confirmed. But people who didn't know this situation that we've just been discussing in terms of Norwich being a self-funded club have almost tried to use that as a stick to beat them with, haven't they?
Yeah, I think given what we've just been discussing, it's the context, isn't it? And the context that Paddy and yourself have laid out there as well. I think people hear Premier League and instantly that becomes money, doesn't it? And it becomes a moral issue in itself. But you've got to almost remove Norwich from that because of the way that they're, just the disparity in wealth and as Paddy discussed, and equally the way they run the club because they don't have majority shareholders who pump in loads of money constantly, or they don't work out a bill and then it gets sent off to the owners and they sign it. It's not like that. They have to almost spend within their means. And I can understand why people are saying this about the Sinani deal, but equally it's a free transfer for a guy who's playing in Luxembourg, so the wages aren't going to be immense anyway. it's not as if they've paid £10 million and have broke their transfer record for a striker or whatnot. And I can understand it from a public issue and like a messaging issue. It doesn't send out the best message, and it doesn't particularly look great. But given the context that we've said, I think it was more partly due to the fact of all the talking he's done in Luxembourg, but equally, as you said there, because there are going to be a lot of supporters who perhaps are on furlough, who are missing football, who are struggling a little bit, and it does give people a lift. Football has that power, and for all the negative talk around this deal and the way it's been announced, there's also a positive aspect to it as well. And I think that needs to be remembered in the discussions that people have around why they've decided to announce the deal when they have, because ultimately this is a player making his dream move to a club that is significantly bigger than the one he plays for at the moment. So with all of that context, for the player as well, for the fans, for the club, I think it made a lot of sense to do it. But yeah, I can understand why it's not a good look and why people perhaps question the financials involved.
But we don't need to talk too much about Mr. Sinani, because I feel like we've been talking about him for months. But he will be a Norwich City player. Whether that means he goes out on loan or not, it's impossible to tell, because we don't even know when next season potentially going to start at this stage. So I think we can park those sort of debates. Let's come on to the PinkUn poser, and we had quite a few responses in. Last week, we asked who are the most underrated or underappreciated Norwich City players. I went for Anthony Pilkington, Pad went for Stephen Whittaker, Tony went for Jason Shackle, and Connor went for Andrew Sermon, which I quite liked. I think I would go with Sermon over Pilkington after hearing your argument for it, Connor. Chris, I'll come to you for your one in a little. In just a minute, but let's have a few other responses. And there was your Whittaker suggestion got a few responses, Pad. But also Mr. Morrison came up quite a lot, which we all now know is a touchy subject with yourself.
I'll definitely go and do my keeping up his now, Dave, if we have to talk about how good Steve Morrison was.
So Mark Woodruff said Malky Mackay. And Ian, which is at Ian_M1, he agreed with Andrew Sermon. For an option further back, he suggested Mark Barham. Matt Gregory said Dixon Atuhu, felt he was given a bit of stick sometimes, but had the physical attributes to be a top player. Eventually left for Fulham in the Premier League, but felt he could have gone higher, and that was 450,000. Nat G says Steve Morrison, no doubt, was attacked by fans in quotation marks, because he wasn't Grant Holt. Same crap that a lot of current players get, Campbell being one last season because he wasn't Emi Buendia. Darren Smith suggested Steen Nedergaard. I think that's a decent little shout. He was almost a bit of a cult hero as well, wasn't he? Michael Garwood says Steve Morrison scored some vital goals for us. Seemed to suffer from some odd belief that he and club legend Grant Holt didn't get on. Mark Davies says Mark Barham. FPL Farker agrees with Sermon. Tommy Dangerous, what a name, suggests Darren Kenton. Chris Nunn agrees with Anthony Pilkington. Just a couple more. This was a good one. Joe Bullock, underappreciated. There is none more than Russell Martin. Absolute disgrace that how he was treated towards the end. One of the all-time greats, in my humble opinion. And Joe Delft does not agree with you, Paddy. He says Whittaker was absolute pony.
Was he? Not in the playoff final, he wasn't.
He wasn't in the playoff final, which was streamed last week, wasn't it? And people were enjoying that a lot. I did see someone, I can't spot it now, but he was saying that Whittaker had sort of fallen to the same treatment as Martin, because they were both really championship players who they persevered within the Premier League. But that might be a little bit harsh. So, Chris, who springs to mind for yourself?
Well, initially I wrote down Fraser Forster, but I think he probably was appreciated in the end. I think it was just my brain was hijacked by the thought I would like him to stay. But I'm going to go for Chris Martin.
Local boy.
Well, yeah, that was one of his problems. I always felt back in the day that Norwich City fans sometimes weren't particularly gracious to the local products. I always thought Ian Henderson got a bit of a rough ride. I think more recently, the Murphy twins got a bit of a rough ride. And Chris Martin off field did. Chris Martin didn't help himself through no fault of his own because of his body language. He did look like he couldn't be probably bothered at times, but I don't think that's true. It's just the way it was a physicality thing. It's just the way he looked. But I mean, he came into the side. Peter Grant put him in early 2005 when Robert Earnshaw was injured. Was it 2005 early doors there?
Yeah, I guess it would be about then, wouldn't it? Or maybe a year or two later.
And he didn't have anybody else, and he put him in, and Chris Martin scored quite a few goals in a short period of time as a young man. And I thought he was really good, a good player. He's had a good career, and if you watch him play now, he's a clever footballer. He's not scoring an awful lot of goals, but he's a real clever player. I would say that his teammates really enjoy playing with him. I just don't think he was particularly appreciated as a Norwich City footballer, and I think he should have been. So that's my candidate for, what was it, most underrated?
Underrated / underappreciated. That sort of vibe.
I think Chris Martin should have been a lot better regarded.
Yeah, he played a major part in the Lambert back-to-back promotions, didn't he? And he was a good player. I don't know if there's something about with local players, because Todd's had it a bit as well, and whether there's maybe a bit of jealousy involved in seeing a local lad making it. Maybe that, you know, people went to school with him and say, oh yeah, he was always the best at school, and, you know, groaned about that sort of jealousy side of things.
Yeah, I don't know. I never understood it, but I did see it. I thought Henderson was the one who got it worse, personally. But I never saw it, but I heard it. When I say I never saw it, I never understood why it happened. Obviously, not everybody went to school with them, so
yeah. You know, I think Hendo's problem was being played out on the right, wasn't it? When he was a striker, as we've seen. And Ryan Jarvis had the
career, really.
He has, yeah.
And Ryan Jarvis, well, I think he's had a great career as well. He's still really, really playing well in his early 30s.
Yeah, he suffered from the body language thing as well at Norwich, didn't he? People sort of said
that's just a physical thing. You can't help it.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly.
There's no way a footballer goes out there and doesn't try, because they get found out pretty damn quick.
Yeah, there's lots of different styles.
Yeah. I like the Stephen Whittaker one, actually, because I felt he was. Sometimes there's a villain, isn't there? Russ became a villain in the end, and I think Stephen Whittaker was an easy target for some people, and that feeling spreads, and they get unfairly regarded. And I think Stephen Whittaker never, ever didn't give his all for Norwich City, and he'll get crap for it, you know, so not good.
Okay, right, well, let's set the new poser then. We're going to go for weird and wonderful moments at Norwich City games, and we're looking for, you know, your funny moments, the ones that stand out, you know, Johnny Howson picking up a pigeon or whatever. So we've all, I hope I haven't just given away any of yours, but we've all got our suggestions, and then if you can get in touch with us, probably Twitter's the best place. You know where we are, at PinkUn. We'll put out a tweet specifically about this, and we want to hear your sort of weird and wonderful moments for Norwich games, because although we're missing it, football isn't just about football, is it? It's about those fun moments, the strange moments, the things that stand out. So, Connor, shall I come to you first? What springs to mind?
Sure. This is probably the one I struggle with the most, actually, in terms of trying to think of something. But I did come up with one in the end. I want to.
He's gone. He's gone. He's back.
We lost you there,
am
mate.
I with you? Okay, good.
Yeah, you're back, though.
I think I've got some dodgy connection there this morning, because I've already had to move to the phone. But
there's all those students in your flat.
It is, yeah. I'll take you back to 2016. Norwich were playing Newcastle at Carrow Road. The ball gets cleared out for, I think it was a throw-in at the time, into the Newcastle away support. The ball then, with the Newcastle fans, they decide that they're going to play a game of catch between themselves for about 5 minutes, and all the Norwich players are looking desperately towards the touchline for a new ball to come in. It doesn't. I think in the end, a ball does come from the fourth official, and then the ball gets thrown back on. Robbie Brady, then Norwich had a free kick at the time, so Robbie Brady's lined up to take the free kick. He curls it in, and Tim Closer heads it into the back of the net. But I remember the response from the Norwich fans towards the Newcastle fans was quite an enjoyable one at that point. So that's what I've gone with. I'm sure that I'll probably be sat here later and there'll be something else that springs to mind. But that was the only one that really I could think of when I was thinking about this morning. So that's my answer.
Like it. That's the sort of thing we're looking for. Pad, anything spring to mind for you?
No, you're not going to beat the Johnny Arson pigeon at West Ham. I mean, absolute. You couldn't, even in your most obtuse thought process, come up with a game where was it a Premier League game? It must have been, yeah.
West Ham, wasn't it?
Premier League game interrupted by a pigeon. One thing, and then the pigeon whispering himself, Johnny Howson, calmly on the pitch, just wandered over, like he was out for a walk on the Yorkshire Dales or whatever, and he never lived that down, did he? But Johnny Howson, what a boy! Yeah, just going off on a tangent. I remember we had some Colney interview with him, and what had he been doing when he was injured? And he said, I was painting my house with my dad or whatever. Just the sort of most un-Premier League footballer type person you could hope to meet. I can't honestly think of anything that would rival that. I mean, there was the bizarre fans throwing season tickets at Brian Gunn. That hadn't happened too often, had it? The infamous Colchester game. And I mean, I'd have to go back to my Cov supporting days. I remember watching a game once, and that absolute world-class West Indian cricketer, Brian Lara, he just appeared behind the goal, walking around the perimeter pitch at Highfield Road. And he just well, I say appeared. I mean, basically, Cov were playing Villa, and he was massive mates with Dwight York at the time.
Okay.
Obviously, both from the same part of the Caribbean, and Dwight York obviously starring for Villa. And literally everybody in the home end where I was sat, just bearing in mind he was there with a Villa person, just applauded. I think it was just around that time where he'd set that world record. Was it 300 odd against England in the Test match? And just an absolute, one of the best cricketers ever to grace the game, and just to see him in the inauspicious surroundings of Highfield Road was all a bit random. So, that's the one that springs to my mind as a football fan. But I seriously couldn't. I could go into a darkened room for 24 hours and I wouldn't come up with anything better than Johnny House and the West Ham pigeon.
That's nice, the Brian Lara one.
I've got another bird-related one. I don't know if you remember. I can't remember what the game was at Carrow Road, but there was it a goose? I think that was just in Carrow Road. I can't remember what game it was, but it was
Swindon in the League Cup.
There we go. Yeah, that was quite a random one.
Yeah, everyone was just busy watching the goose, weren't they? As you mentioned Coventry there, Pat, I realise that we've swapped colours here. I'm wearing sky blue and you're wearing green and yellow.
Yeah, but unfortunately it's New York Cosmos, so I haven't changed allegiance to that degree.
Very nice.
Yeah.
You just reminded me of one, actually, while you were talking. Chris, did you cover the 2002 playoff final?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you've seen this as well, and I always joke to my best mate that we've seen Atomic Kitten in concert.
Yes,
because they played at half time.
Day, Atomic Who?
Yeah,
it was the most irrelevant piece of music and theatre or whatever you have ever seen.
It was very
odd.
odd.
A blind bit of notice.
In an absolutely boiling hot Millennium Stadium because the roof was closed, and it was just
it was ludicrous.
It was like being in a jungle. But my best mate and his wife came over for dinner a couple of months ago, and I dropped that into the conversation. I was like, "Oh yeah, me and Joe have seen Atomic Kitten live." And she said, "What?"
I don't know how live they were, Dave.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. Good point. Chris, your nomination.
I mean, Brian Lara at Highfield Road's all very well, but Mike Tyson at London Road beats that for me.
There you go.
Nice.
I wasn't there, sadly. I have seen, bizarrely, away from Norwich, I've seen an international footballer playing club football, came out for the second half of the game, out of the tunnel, and smoke was coming out of his mouth because he just got his cigarette out. But that's by the by. I'm sort of struggling on this one. I written down the ticket throwing incident in 2009. Very sad in a way, but it was bizarre as well because the person who stopped the ticket throws was Ian Culverhouse. Poor old Gunny stood there watching it all
and Lambert
develop a few yards away. Yeah, Cully was sort of first in there, and Lambert, who we know likes a bit of a ruck at that part of the football pitch. At Carrow Road, he didn't join in as much. I'm really surprised about that. He probably knew what was coming a week later. I was at Carrow Road in 2005. Was it 2005? Man City and Lesby Avenue.
Ah, yes.
Of course.
I was in the loo. So
I
didn't see it or hear it.
Yeah, I did.
Believe it.
Where were you?
I was in the loo. Honestly, when you're covering the footy match, you only have one opportunity if you need to go to the loo, and that's
very
half time.
true. Yeah, that's very true.
So yeah, I missed that, and that's sort of sad. I don't know. I mean, I saw the pigeon thing on TV. One of the most bizarre Norwich City stories, not an incident, was Carlo Nash and his rush to be or not to be the player of the season a few years ago.
Yeah.
I quite like that, but no,
Well,
I don't know.
The Delia incident. I was a season ticket holder in Lower Berkeley at that point, and normally at half time I'd have disappeared off for a beer, but I think I had work or something after the game. Like I was on my moped at the time because I think I was 16 or 17, so I couldn't have another beer, so I just stayed up. And I would never normally watch what was going on at half time, but that day I happened to have stayed in my seat. And I remember as she came out just being like, what is going on here? Yeah, she'll never live that one down.
I did watch the 2015 playoff semi-final against Ipswich amongst Ipswich fans, but bizarrely in the South Stand, because I was a guest of a former editor of ours from that part of the world. You'll know who I mean.
Yeah.
Who invited a lot of his friends, but didn't tell me that they were all Ipswich fans. So there were 11 people, and one person wanted Norwich City to win, and the rest wanted Ipswich to win in the South Stand.
One of them wasn't Ed Sheeran, was it?
What? No. I don't think so.
You wouldn't have known if it was.
No, that was quite interesting. But I think it's got to be the weirdest thing ever. It's got to be Delia, that rant. You know, and it is a rant. I mean, if you look into the Oxford English Dictionary under rant, you'll see a picture of Delia as that thing. You know, it was a rant.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, my one, and then we'll throw it over to you guys. The funnier the better. For me, the first one that sprang out was Spud as the fourth official. A couple of years ago against Preston. The officials have to change it around. They need a new fourth official, and we're all in the press box. What's going on? What's going on? And then who is it that comes up in his jeans? None other than columnist, sort of famous fan, David Spud Thornhill. And just the smile on his face, but in the press box,
that's always there.
In sort of unison, when we all realised, we all just went, "He's Spud," and everyone quickly starts typing away and putting it out on Twitter and stuff, don't they? But that moment when he had to hold up the board for the added time, and was it 10 minutes added time or something like that, something stupid, and he tried to look serious, held it up, tried to look as official as he could, and his smile slowly broke out as everyone cheered, and that was just a wonderful moment that, you know, sort of had very little to do with the football, but I'll always remember it was so funny, and he became like a celebrity overnight, didn't he? He was all the nationals who wanted to talk to him and everything. So there's loads of this sort of stuff out there, and we want to hear the weird and wonderful, the funnier the better. And as I say, Twitter is probably the best place to get in touch. Just finally then, guys, just a bit of a catch-up with what you boys have been busy doing on the sports desk. Connor, you've interviewed another 50 or so former Norwich players, I'd imagine?
Feels like that, yeah, feels like that. I'm trying to think who we've had in the last week. Michael Nelson, that was yesterday. Went up yesterday.
Darryl Russell, that was good.
Darryl Russell, yeah, that was a good one, actually. He was very good. I think that's in podcast form, so it's worth checking it out because he's quite honest, actually, and it was good to hear from him, actually, because he's not someone we hear too much from. So I think they're the two this week.
Javier Garrido, was that in
Javier
last week?
Garrido, yeah, that's another one. Thanks, Dave. Good job you're here. Javier Garrido was another one. Good to hear from him, albeit via email because his English isn't the best, but he said some nice things about the club as well, and he's gone into coaching and stuff like that. So that was good. So I think unless you're going to remind me of any more, that was the three of this week. I think.
Just remind us of the gist of Russell. He was talking about that phase when Roda was playing him as a striker, wasn't he, and how difficult he found that.
Yeah, he said he felt it effectively damaged his reputation, both in the game and also how the supporters viewed him. So that was interesting in terms of that spell as well. I think he essentially said that the players didn't like Glenn Roda much, which I'm sure is probably not news to a lot of people. But I think it was a very difficult spell for him personally, but also for the club. He then spoke about being put on gardening leave just before Paul Lambert came in, and think it was that summer and that process and how difficult that was for him and how he felt let down, I think were the words he used at that point. So there's a lot of really good, honest stuff that are there as well. And even the way he talks about sort of when he came through and playing under Brian Hamilton and how difficult he found that and that relationship, that was interesting as well. So there's really good stuff in there actually from Daryl. I think it's about an hour long. So if you're looking to kill some time in isolation, that's well worth a listen.
And Pad, you had a chat with a real Norwich character in Bill Punton.
That's one word I'd use for Dave, yeah. 85, still going strong. I didn't put it in, actually. I was a bit concerned, but he's telling me he's doing a 4-mile walk every day, given the restrictions that are on certain age groups. I thought I'd leave that one out. Otherwise, he might have the constabulary around his house. But, yeah, no, he's fighting fit. And the hook on that, of course, was where we are now. The only thing that's anywhere near comparable in terms of football shutting down mid-season was since the Second World War, was the Great Freeze of 62-63, which was Norwich played one league game in 2 months. And it was also a nice parallel with the current season. The year they got to an FA Cup quarter-final at home to Leicester, which still is Norwich's record Carrow Road attendance, just under 44,000. Terry Alcott missed the penalty against the great Gordon Banks. Leicester won the game, went on to go all the way to Wembley. So just got Bill's thoughts on that. And actually this morning, I've got it in front of me now, I've had an email from a guy who was at the game, prompted by that article, Trevor Leader. I just want to read a little section of this out because it's lovely. Obviously, the world we live in now, we have maybe younger demographics who consume our content online and social media, but our older readers as well. I clearly chimed with them. He said he was 16 at the time, although living near Diss. He wasn't going to miss the game. In those days, we went in the river end. It was open standing. I like this bit. The thing that sticks in Trevor's memory was the tannoy announcer saying, "Beware of pickpockets." So I don't know quite what that says about the Norwich supporters at that time. He says we were so tightly packed in, you couldn't even get your hand in your pockets. So I don't think they needed to worry. And he also recollects they played Stoke that season again, and the legendary Sir Stanley Matthews was playing. So great memories, as Trevor says. And like I say, I mean, Bill was recalling, the congestion that then accrued. I think they played 5 FA Cup ties in 20 days that season, which was just ridiculous. But obviously, a different time, a different era. But, probably the only thing that's comparable, there was a nice anecdote from Bill about Norwich didn't have any training facilities, so they had to go and play in the old St. Faith's Aerodrome hangars. Which apparently the floors were concrete. That wouldn't have done a lot for the old joints, I don't think. But yeah, no, a bygone era. Nice to have a bit of a walk down memory lane with Bill. And the main thing is, as he said, to be fair, to bring it up to date, he thinks, taking us full circle now with what we discussed at the start, he thinks you've got to stop the season now, just abandon it, restart again next season. It's safe to do so. People are obviously sadly losing their lives in huge numbers around the world, and football is immaterial in that context. So for Bill, there shouldn't be any talk of restarting, but he knows himself, and he mentioned it, the finances that are involved sadly will dictate that these conversations continue to happen. So yeah, that was a nice article this week, and hopefully we can pull 1 or 2 more of those out as we move forward, because I don't think we're going to have any football anytime soon, boys.
Absolutely, yeah. Top man, Bill Punton. I've spoken to him a couple of times. Got a great sense of humour, hasn't he? Right, well, I think that's pretty much it for today. We've got, of course, the 1-year anniversaries of all the promotion, fun and games coming up. So that will be in the next couple of weeks. We'll get to sort of relive all that, I guess, with a slight sense of sadness, really, because it'll sort of remind us of all of what we're missing a little bit. But great memories as well. So that will be coming up. And the quiz again, Friday night, 7 p.m. went very well last couple of weeks, isn't it, Chris? Connor's been doing a very good job on that, hasn't he? And Spud helped out last Friday.
Absolutely. I tell you what, it's been really enjoyable.
Yeah,
it's been a good. I know they're difficult times, but I do think, certainly from a very personal point of view, an hour and a half on a Friday night is brilliant. Yeah, it's good.
And it was quite tough as well.
Very good question, Master. Except when things fall down in his cupboard behind him, and the cats appear. But it's really good. Yeah, some of them are tough. I thought Spud, who has every right to produce 10 very difficult questions, was really good. When he said they're multiple choice, I could have sang hallelujah, frankly, because you know you're not going to be that dumb. If he hadn't done that, I'd have been struggling. But no, it's really good fun. I don't think we need to urge people to listen to it. It is that good. It should be just up there on a Friday night with a bit of Peter Kay at 9:30 and at 10 o'clock Friday night dinner.
Well, I got 26 out of 50, so that shows that it was reasonably difficult. Pad got 31, Chris 29, Spud got 32 out of 40 because he can't be judged, of course, on his own round. But
I got full marks, but then I know the answers.
Well done, mate.
Does make it a bit easier.
There's
I think
my.
you got a couple wrong, frankly, but there you
go. So yeah, 7 o'clock on Friday, and you can watch that by Twitter or on PinkUn.com is the place to be, and that's a good bit of fun. Right, thank you very much, chaps. Look after yourselves, and thank you very much for listening. We hope that this at least provides a little bit of football familiarity, even though we haven't got any football to talk about. But to be quite frank, I'd be happy to be doing a live blog on a 2020 game down a village green at the moment. If we could just have a little bit of football or sport or whatever, that would be nice. But we'll try and keep things moving in the meantime. Thank you very much for listening. We will catch up with you very soon.